Welcome to English with Afreen. To get the targeted score, try this listening test 2 times. Best of luck. You will hear a number of different recordings, and you'll have to answer questions on what you hear. There will be time for you to read the instructions and questions, and you'll have a chance to check your work. All the recordings will be played once only. The test is in 4 sections. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet. Now turn to Section 1. Section 1. You will hear a conversation between 2 students and a counselor about their experience in the university. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Hi there, John. Come on in. How are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Hi, Afreen. How's things?
Okay.
Well, as I explained on the phone, I am a counselor here at the Student Services section of the university, and I am interviewing overseas students to help me draw up a guide for new students. So I'd be grateful if you could tell me a little about your time since you have been here in Cambridge.
Right.
Good idea.
Now, John, let's start with you. Okay, this is your second semester, isn't it? Could you tell us something about your first impressions of the town when you arrived?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was struck by how quiet it is here in the evening.
Yes, I suppose Cambridge is a quiet place. Where did you live when you first arrived?
Well, I went straight into student accommodation. It was a kind of student hostel.
All right, so you didn't have to worry about doing your own cooking or anything like that.
No, but something I wished I had. The food at the hostel was awful.
Oh dear, but how were the other students?
To be honest, I haven't managed to make many friends even though the place is full. People seem to keep to themselves. They are not really very friendly.
Oh, I am very sorry to hear that. Well, what about the actual course? You are studying.
I'm doing a master's by coursework in environmental studies.
Ah, right. And how are you finding that?
Yeah, well, it's been pretty good really. I've enjoyed the course, but I feel there hasn't been enough contact with the lecturers. They all seem to be incredibly busy. The only chance I've really had to talk to them was on the field trip.
Well, that's no good. Could anything be done to improve the course in your opinion?
Well, I think it would be helpful to have meetings with lecturers on the course. Say once a fortnight, something like that.
Regular meetings. Yes, that could certainly help. Okay, John. We will come back to you in a minute, but I would just like to ask Afreen some questions.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now, listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Afreen, where are you from?
I am from India.
And how did you find Cambridge when you first arrived?
Well, I like it here. I think the city is very beautiful.
What about your accommodation? Was that okay?
Yes, at first I stayed with a family for 3 months. They were very kind to me, but they had 3 young children, and I found it difficult to study.
Right, I see.
So after 3 months I moved out, and I live with 2 other students in a student house. It's much cheaper and we like it there.
Good. And what about your studies? What are you studying?
I am doing a Bachelor of Computer.
I see. Apart from the language difficulties, if you can separate them, how have you found the course?
Well, the main difficulty for me is getting time on the computers in the computer room. It's always busy, and this makes it very hard to do my practical work.
Yes, I am sure it would. Can you reserve time in the computer room?
No, you can't, but it would certainly help if we could reserve time.
Yes, I will look into that and see if something can be done to improve things over there. Now let's go back to John.
That is the end of Section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to Section 2. Section 2, you will hear a brief introduction speech by a tour guide about Oniton Hall. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 14. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 14.
Good morning and welcome to Oniton Hall, one of the largest estates in the area. My name's Christian and I'm one of the guides. I'll give you a brief introduction to the estate while you're sitting down and then we'll walk round. The estate consists of the house, gardens, parkland and far, and it dates back to the 14th century. The original house was replaced in the late 17th century and of course it has had a large number of owners. Almost all of them have left their mark, generally by adding new rooms, like the ballroom and conservatory, or by demolishing others. The farm looks much as it's always done, although the current owner has done a great deal of work to the flower beds. In the 17th century, the estate was owned by a very wealthy man called Sir Edward Downes. His intention was to escape from the world of politics after years as an active politician and to build a new house worthy of his big collection of books, paintings, and sculptures. He broke off contact with his former political allies and hosted meetings of creative and literary people like painters and poets. Unusually for his time, he didn't care whether his guests were rich or poor as long as they had talent. Big houses like Oniton had dozens of servants until the 1920s or 1930s, and we've tried to show what their working lives were like. Photographs of course don't give much of an idea, so instead, as you go round the house, you'll see volunteers dressed up as 19th century servants going about their work. They'll explain what they're doing and tell you their recipes or what tools they're using. We've just introduced this feature to replace the audio guide we used to have available. I see there are a number of children here with you today. Well, we have several activities specially for children, like dressing up in the sorts of clothes that children wore in the past, and as it's a fine day, some of you will probably want to play in the adventure playground. Our latest addition is child-sized tractors that you can drive around the grounds.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 15 to 20. Now, listen and answer questions 15 to 20.
We'll also be going into the farm that's part of the estate, where there's plenty to do. Most of the buildings date from the 18th century, so you can really step back into an agricultural past. Until recently, the dairy was where milk from the cows was turned into cheese. It's now the place to go for lunch or afternoon tea, or just a cup of coffee and a slice of homemade cake. The big stone building that dominates the farm is the large barn, and in here is our collection of agricultural tools. These were used in the past to plow the earth, sow seeds, make gates, and much more. There's a small barn, also made of stone, where you can groom the donkeys and horses to keep their coats clean. They really seem to enjoy having it done, and children love grooming them. The horses no longer live in the stables, which instead is the place to go to buy gifts, books, our own jams and pickles, and clothes and blankets made of wool from our sheep. Outside the shed, which is the only brick building, you can climb into a horse-drawn carriage for a lovely, relaxing tour of the park and farm. The carriages are well over 100 years old. And finally, the parkland, which was laid out in the 18th century with a lake and trees that are now well established. You'll see types of cattle and sheep that are hardly ever found on farms these days. We're helping to preserve them to stop their numbers falling further. Okay, well, if you'd like to come with me.
That is the end of Section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to Section 3. Section 3. You will hear a student called Sandra talking to her tutor about a draft proposal written for competition. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Right, Sandra. You wanted to see me to get some feedback on your group's proposal, the one you're submitting for the Geography Society field trip competition.
Uh-huh.
I've had a look through your proposal, and I think it's a really good choice.
Oh.
In fact, I only have a few things to say about it, but even in an outline document like this, you really have to be careful to avoid typos and problems with layout in the proposal, and even in the contents page. So read it through carefully before submitting it, okay?
Will do.
And I've made a few notes on the proposal about things which could have been better sequenced.
Okay.
As for the writing itself, I've annotated the proposal as and where I thought it could be improved. Generally speaking, I feel you've often used complex structures and long sentences for the sake of it, and as a consequence, although your paragraphing and inclusion of subheadings help, it's quite hard to follow your train of thought at times.
Oh.
So, cut them down a bit, can you?
Really?
Yes, and don't forget simple formatting like numbering.
Didn't I use page numbers?
I didn't mean that. Look, you've remembered to include headers and footers, which is good, but listing ideas clearly is important. Number them or use bullet points, which is even clearer. Then you'll focus the reader on your main points. I thought your suggestion to go to the Navajo Tribal Park was a very good idea.
No, I've always wanted to go there. My father was a great fan of cowboy films and the Wild West, so I was subjected to seeing all the epics, many of which were shot there.
Mm-hmm.
As a consequence, it feels very familiar to me, and it's awesome, both geographically and visually. So it's somewhere I've always wanted to visit. The subsequent research I did and the online photographs made me even keener.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Interesting. Right, let's look at the content of your proposal now.
Did you find it comprehensive enough?
Well, yes and no. You've listed several different topics on your contents page, but I'm not sure they're all relevant.
No? Well, I thought that from the perspective of a field trip, one thing I needed to focus on was the sandstone plateau and cliffs themselves. The way they tower up from the flat landscape is just amazing. The fact that the surrounding softer rocks were eroded by wind and rain, leaving these huge outcrops high above the plain. It's hardly surprising that tourists flock to see the area.
Well, yes, I'd agree with including those points.
And then the fact that it's been home to Native American Navajos and all the social history that goes with that. The hardships they endured trying to save their territory from the invading settlers. Their culture is so rich. All those wonderful stories.
Well, I agree it's interesting, but it's not immediately relevant to your proposal, Sandra. So, at this stage, I suggest you focus on other considerations. I think an indication of what the students on the trip could actually do when they get there should be far more central, so that certainly needs to be included and to be expanded upon. And I'd like to see something about the local wildlife and vegetation, too. Not that I imagine there's much to see. Presumably the tourist invasion hasn't helped.
Okay, I'll do some work on those two areas as well. But you're right, there's not much apart from some very shallow-rooted species. Although it's cold and snowy there in the winter, the earth is baked so hard in the summer sun that rainwater can't penetrate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a case of flood or drought, really.
So I understand. Now, before we look at everything in more detail, I've got a few factual questions for you. It would be a good idea to include the answers in your finished proposal, because they're missing from your draft.
Fine.
So you mentioned the monoliths and the spires, which was good. But what area does the tribal park cover? Do you know?
12,000 hectares, and the plain is at about 5,850 meters above sea level.
Larger than I expected. Okay, where's the nearest accommodation? That's a practical detail that you haven't included. Have you done any research on that?
Yes. There's nowhere to stay in the park itself, but there's an old trading post called Goulding quite near. All kinds of tours start from Goulding, too.
What kind of tours?
Well, the most popular are in four-wheel drive Jeeps, but I wouldn't recommend hiring those. I think the best way to appreciate the area would be to hire horses instead and trek around on those. Biking is not allowed, and it's impossible to drive around the area in private vehicles. The tracks are too rough.
Okay. Lastly, what else is worth visiting there?
There are several caves, but I haven't looked into any details. I'll find out about them.
Okay, good. Now what I'd like to know is more about...
That is the end of Section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to Section 4. Section 4, you will hear a lecture about Icelandic language from a lecturer. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Right, everyone, let's make a start. Over the past few sessions, we've been considering the reasons why some world languages are in decline, and today I'm going to introduce another factor that affects languages and the speakers of those languages, and that's technology and, in particular, digital technology. In order to illustrate its effect, I'm going to focus on the Icelandic language, which is spoken by around 321,000 people, most of whom live in Iceland, an island in the North Atlantic Ocean. The problem for this language is not the number of speakers, even though this number is small, nor is it about losing words to other languages, such as English. In fact, the vocabulary of Icelandic is continually increasing because when speakers need a new word for something, they tend to create one rather than borrowing from another language. All this makes Icelandic quite a special language. It's changed very little in the past millennium, yet it can handle 21st century concepts related to the use of computers and digital technology. Take, for example, the word for web browser. This is vafri in Icelandic, which comes from the verb to wander. I can't think of a more appropriate term, because that's exactly what you do mentally when you browse the internet. Then there's an Icelandic word for podcast, which is too hard to pronounce. And so on. Icelandic, then, is alive and growing. And it's a big but young Icelanders spend a great deal of time in the digital world, and this world is predominantly English. Think about smartphones. They didn't even exist until comparatively recently, but today young people use them all the time to read books, watch TV or films, play games, listen to music, and so on. Obviously, this is a good thing in many respects because it promotes their bilingual skills, but the extent of the influence of English in the virtual world is staggering, and it's all happening really fast. For their parents and grandparents, the change is less concerning because they already have their native speaker skills in Icelandic. But for young speakers, well, the outcome is a little troubling. For example, teachers have found that playground conversations in Icelandic secondary schools can be conducted entirely in English, while teachers of much younger children have reported situations where their classes find it easier to say what is in a picture using English rather than Icelandic. The very real and worrying consequence of all this is that the young generation in Iceland is at risk of losing its mother tongue. Of course, this is happening to other European languages too, but while internet companies might be willing to offer, say, French options in their systems, it's much harder for them to justify the expense of doing the same for a language that has a population the size of a French town, such as Nice. The other drawback of Icelandic is the grammar, which is significantly more complex than in most languages. At the moment, the tech giants are simply not interested in tackling this. So, what is the Icelandic government doing about this? Well, large sums of money are being allocated to a language technology fund that, it is hoped, will lead to the development of Icelandic-sourced apps and other social media and digital systems, but clearly this is going to be an uphill struggle. On the positive side, they know that Icelandic is still the official language of education and government. It has survived for well over 1,000 years, and the experts predict that its future in this nation-state is sound and will continue to be so. However, there's no doubt that it's becoming an inevitable second choice in young people's lives. This raises important questions. When you consider how much of the past is tied up in a language, will young Icelanders lose their sense of their own identity? Another issue that concerns the government of Iceland is this. If children are learning two languages through different routes, neither of which they are fully fluent in, will they be able to express themselves properly?
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers. That is the end of the listening test. You would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the answer sheet.
If you score 1 to 18, you are unlikely to get an acceptable score under examination conditions, and we recommend that you spend a lot of time improving your English before you take IELTS. If you score 19 to 27, you may get an acceptable score under examination conditions, but we recommend that you think about having more practice or lessons before you take IELTS. If you score 28 to 40, you are likely to get an acceptable score under examination conditions, but remember that different institutions will find different scores acceptable. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it.